now. So who wants to chair the meeting in Scott's absence?
Go for it, Fred.
Okay, let's start today's Land Use Committee meeting. We're all present except for Scott. And let's start with our first item for the mayor's donation policy.
Okay, well, it's I'm actually plagiarized it from Bainbridge Island, obviously, what's in your packet. And what's been going on is here lately is we've had a rash of people wanting to donate benches, and we have some concerns with free speech and inscriptions on limiting or controlling what is going to go on a bench. So how I've combated that in the last year or so is we've got a project with the South Kitsap Rotary Club where we've identified some locations for some benches. They're selling the benches. They're produced by Leader Manufacturing. We identified the bench and they've sold 3 of those benches. Tony and Chris from Public Works and I walked McCormick Village Park, identified 7 locations for benches because we got somebody that would like to buy a bench for there. And I'd like to identify locations at other parks too, in Van Zee and Clayton Park tends to have, I think, enough benches, but maybe we could identify a spot or 2 there too. But my goal would be have a policy similar to what Bainbridge has developed, and then it will have examples of the benches, a map potentially, or maybe it's an appendix that's separate that we update from time to time as benches get sold. And then I go to the service clubs, and I wouldn't, we did this with the South Kitsap Rotary Club downtown. I'd like to offer it to any service club that they get to put, the service club on it, and then a person buys the bench. And that way we're not procuring benches, but yet we have some control over what these benches look like and their uniform throughout the city. So that's my crazy idea.
Yeah, I if I can weigh in, look good. I understand the need, and I understand, from Rotary where that was coming from. The only question I had on it was the 5 years, why it had to have any mentioning of a time in there. And
the things I don't like about their policy is they're wanting to collect money too for maintenance.
Right.
I mean, this isn't, I just brought this forward as an example.
Okay. I wasn't sure.
That isn't going to be, I mean, it's an example of what Bainbridge did. Mm-hmm. I'm sure Carrie can wordsmith a much better policy than this is, using this as an example, but things I didn't care for. Why would it be closed-ended? I don't think it's real. I mean, those benches that the Rotary Club selling, they're $3,800 a piece. They're expensive. Right. And the ones in McCormick Village aren't quite as expensive. They're recycled plastic. They aren't the wrought iron version, but they're not cheap. They're still $2,500, probably at least. And I don't have a problem if the service club wants to make $300 or $500 on it too, as a fundraiser.
No, I thought it was good. I just, as a starting point, I just didn't like some things about their policy, and we're not Bainbridge Island. And I also just wanted to weigh in that, from anything that we do or get as donated, there's never a free lunch. In other words, the city now owns them and now maintains them and now has liability for them. So, but at the same time, as long as we have the option of whether we take the donation or not, I think that's the big key. But yeah, it's great.
And really, I was, I heard Council Member Ashby standing on my shoulder and whispering in my ear, "Where's my policy?" If I tried to bring this forward. So right. I started with the policy this time, even though it's not ours.
I think it looks good. I'm a little curious under 3B. I forget what page is on page 3, where it talks about signage, donation acknowledgement, determined by city staff. Do we need to have guidelines on? Well, I suppose we'll have to have. Or
I would ask. I mean, this is just a starting point. If you guys have edits that you'd like to see, let's get those edits to Carrie, and maybe next month we come back with something that has our logo on it, and some examples of what we want to see in the benches, you know, because this was their furnishings that they picked, and I'm just going to go out and replicate what's already in the parks, you know, and match what we have. They all came from Leader Manufacturing.
No, I think Fred has a valid point because, you know, plaques are placed on these things, or we've seen plaques on other donated items, and that's something to be of concern. Sorry, I'm printing off in the background. Apologize.
No, and I wish there weren't going to be any problems with who people want to acknowledge on a bench. You know, I guess we could say it should be. I mean, I'm just thinking, would we even limit it to like an individual who's lived or been associated with the city, for example? But I can understand that we have to watch that because we don't want them to acknowledge an organization, and I don't know that we have any control over that. And that's where, I mean, just like with the signs, you know, can we tell people where they can put signs in the city? I know that's
this is delicate, and I don't even know that we want this language in here because of free speech.
Yeah.
And that's, I think we're going to need to talk to the attorney about that. You capturing that little where he's talking about in B, Carrie?
3B signage, yeah.
Yes.
You know, and I don't know who the gatekeeper there is. Nick Bond, development director.
That's fine with me. All right, and it's too bad we can't say things like common sense and good taste.
Yeah. Okay, but it's a great starting point, and I think I heard, what is it? Carrie gets our edits or comments. So.
Yeah, if you got your edits and comments to Carrie, I'm working on maps, and I'll work on examples of the furnishings that we're looking to have.
Sounds good. Okay. Let's go into item 2, the Downtown Sub-Area Plan Economic Study.
I'm going to share my screen here. Give me just a second. Okay, so I just wanted to provide the economic analysis that is serving as the foundation for the Downtown Sub-Area Plan and Planned Action EIS. This was presented last month at the last Economic Development Committee meeting, and our consultant actually walked through the entire report for that committee. And so if you want a detailed explanation of any of this, that would be a good place to look, would be to watch the Economic Development Committee meeting. But I wanted to draw your attention to 2 slides within the study that are kind of forming the basis of the alternatives under the Planned Action EIS. And on slide 44, you see that there are 3 scenarios listed for residential and for commercial capacity. And these are captured in residential units and in commercial square footage. And they kind of show a low, medium, and high scenario. And as under scenario 2, which is more residential compared to commercial, the square footage and the unit count shifts. As you get more residential, you get less commercial based on the available buildable land within the downtown area. But in any event, we're looking at sort of a range of 1,000 to about 1,350 residential units and about 580 to 805,000 square feet of commercial construction, including what's proposed at the county courthouse. So this just gives you a snapshot of sort of the range of development scenarios that are going to be considered moving forward here. There's a lot of other good information in this report. I think I was going to show you slide 38, which is the buildable land capacity within the downtown, and it shows the sub-area planning boundaries. And so the sub-area that we are studying actually, you know, Blackjack Creek bisects it, and so it goes up Mitchell by the high school up to Mile Hill, and then it goes up past the courthouse to a little south of Givens Field. And within that, you can see which properties are considered redevelopable, which ones are vacant, and what is underutilized. And then the land use categories are shown there on the left. So this was just really an informational piece that I wanted to distribute to the Land Use Committee, because ultimately the sub-area plan is more suited for the Land Use Committee, but the economic development assumptions we wanted to share with ED Tourism. So if there's any questions, I can try to answer them, but I think the consultant would be the better person for tackling any questions that you have. But I'm happy to try.
I'll have to watch the meeting.
Okay.
Nick, do you remember the criteria for determining if something was redevelopable? Because I'm looking at the hatch mark areas, and I know they're not all vacant. Do you remember?
I don't remember the specific criteria, but it has to do with the assessed valuation of a building compared to the land value. And so if you have a very low value structure relative to the value of the land, it is seen as being something that somebody might target to acquire that land because it has a higher and better use potentially.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I don't have any other comments. Anyone else have any questions or comments?
Not till I watch the meeting.
Okay, I was in that meeting, so I'm not going to watch it again. All right, let's move on to multifamily tax exemption areas.
All right. So at the work study meeting, we presented our framework for moving this this issue forward. We have done some work on updating the maps. We are not finished yet. We could only get 2 of the 3 maps done in time for today's meeting, but we wanted to check in to show you what those looked like and see if you had any concerns. And so the type 1 tax exemption, this is the 12-year exemption for affordable housing. Essentially anything that is zoned business, professional, commercial corridor, mixed use of the 4 types of mixed use, or residential 3 and 4 that is within the purple boundaries of each of our centers, which is, it's a little hard to see on a small map, but when this is blown up, it's easier. So anything that has color to it on this map essentially is an area where you would be able to qualify for the affordable housing tax exemption. And I just wanted to see if there were any concerns with the properties selected or that certain properties were not selected. This was based on, we looked at the transit map issue, and as Councilmember Clausen said, they look sometimes as high as 3/4 of a mile as being walkable for transit. If you do a 3/4 mile radius on transit lines, it's essentially the entire city. Even a half mile covers almost the entire city. And so really anything within any of our designated centers is within a half a mile from transit. And so under that criteria would be eligible. I will say that some properties that currently have a multifamily tax exemption along Bethel between Lund and Mile Hill, currently they are eligible for the multifamily tax exemption, but they are going to lose that because they are not within a center boundary. And so that's the main, I think that's the biggest change here, is that we're expanding it within the centers and it's going away for the handful of properties that were not located within a center. So any questions on the type 1 map or concerns?
It just seems like there's a lot of areas that are outside of downtown.
Right.
And I know the downtown area is really small and hard to see, but it just seems that if I were an investor, it's like you'd go for the bigger areas that are closer to the highway. It's just an observation. I'm not sure that this tax exemption is doing what, I don't know, I don't think it's encouraging development in the areas that I think need encouraging, like the downtown area.
Right. So I guess by moving the threshold for qualifying as affordable housing, it is much harder to qualify for the properties that are on this map because you have to provide them at such a below market rate. So it truly is providing 12 years worth of units that are significantly below the fair market rent.
It's a good point, Nick, because we're expanding the map and tightening the criteria.
Right. And you know, talking to some developers, even under the existing framework, which is that they provide market rate affordable units, the reporting requirement is so complex for them, they're not even interested in doing it under the existing framework. So I think the likelihood that people are going to use this, and unless the economics of developing multifamily housing change significantly, I think this is still going to be a limited use proposition. And by casting a wider net, we may actually get some affordable units, but I still think it's going to be hard for, you know, a developer is really going to have to make an effort to qualify for this above what is currently required.
Okay, that sounds fair.
So the second tax exemption map is the type 3 tax exemption map, and this is the 8-year tax exemption, but you're only eligible for this if you provide structured parking, or if the units are in a mixed use building. And so this is the one where we're really trying to encourage the development of our centers with a form that is more expensive to build and has a higher long-term tax return on property tax to the city. And so again, this looks very similar to the first map. It is only for properties of the zones that allow for the construction of apartments and mixed use shopfront type buildings. And again, this one may be more interesting for developers because they don't have to do the reporting for affordable units, but the upfront cost to them is going to be higher. And so this is a way to offset that cost, and includes essentially all of our centers with the appropriate zoning throughout the city. And then the third map is much more targeted. Carrie and I basically went through and number one, we ran a GIS analysis where we identified the properties that had the low building valuation relative to land value ratio. And we are hand picking properties, saying, you know, based on the condition, based on code enforcement issues or nonconformities and other factors, we're going through and identifying specific properties that we want to target with the easier path for redevelopment because of the higher upfront cost of buying the property. And so that map takes more work to create. And so Carrie is still working on that one, and we should have it for you to review in our August meeting, but it just wasn't ready yet for today.
Okay, for a minute there, I thought it was in our packet, so I was concerned. Nope. Okay.
Yeah, I only printed 2 maps. Nick, about the second map, or the type 3 tax exemption.
Yeah.
If we had these conditions in place, do you think the Sinclair apartments would have developed the way they did?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think number one, we didn't have our zoning code in place, and our zoning code currently requires, if it had the zoning that we have now, they would look differently regardless of whether they had tax exemptions or not. Okay. So part of it is a zoning code requirement, and now our zoning code actually requires the development of these types of buildings, but they are cost prohibitive. And so the zoning code is going to drive the form, and the tax exemption is going to drive the commercial viability of actually doing the project. So it's a 2-pronged approach to trying to implement our plans.
Okay, I guess my only thought about what happened there is that it was mixed use, and they decided to put residential in part of the parcel instead of making the building itself a true mixed use building. And I know that we're having questions about the viability of more commercial buildings, or
right.
But it would have. I was concerned that they got to do that, and there are vacant corners. Is there talk about the vacant corner becoming a true mixed use building, or is that going to just be commercial?
Walk-ups.
It's kind of a hybrid. The commercial mixed use still, it really isn't viable there. They're proposing to do live work units on the ground floor that have extra glass. If somebody wanted to operate a barbershop or something out of their unit, they can do that. And it's also, the construction of the building requires, it's built to the commercial standard. And so they can convert those ground floor units into shop fronts if there is a market in the future. So this is something that's been successfully done elsewhere, where the ground floor unit, it's essentially an apartment that's adaptable for commercial use and has a form that is more similar to a commercial use.
Oh, that sounds good. Well, is the living unit above the storefront, or?
In this case, it's going to be behind the storefront.
Okay.
So you'll have a front room that is designed as like a little commercial space, whether you're an accountant or doing some other type of business. And then the back of the unit will be set up for residential living. But the entire unit is fire rated and everything so that it can be a commercial space in the future. It's going to have fire sprinklers and could be adapted. Although if you were trying to do like a restaurant or something that required major mechanical equipment, that would be more difficult. But some commercial use is permissible, and the building is really designed so that signage is allowed, and there is a place for signage on the ground above the what would be future storefronts, etc.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. All right, thank you. Okay, if there are no further comments, let's go on to Ruby Creek.
Yeah, so I thought I had the Ruby Creek plan open, but maybe I closed it here. Just give me 1 second. Oh, it's a Word document. That's my problem. Let me share the Ruby Creek plan with you. Okay, so this is just kind of a sneak preview of what we're going to be presenting to the Planning Commission tomorrow night. I wanted the Land Use Committee to be familiar with this because once it comes from the Planning Commission, hopefully in August or September, we would take it to the Land Use Committee for additional recommendation and review before it gets reviewed by the full council. And so the plan started back in November, and we created a public process that we intended to carry out prior to coronavirus. And because of coronavirus, we have not been able to schedule any open houses or any public meetings for in-person interaction. We're instead going to be relying on just public hearings at the Planning Commission. And we did do our online survey, but even with sending direct mailers to every unit in the apartments out there, we didn't get a whole lot of response. It just seems that people aren't very interested in this project. And I think because most of the residents out there are renters, they maybe don't feel like they have a long-term stake in what happens, or they're not going to be around long enough to see what develops. So the plan, it really focuses on developing a main commercial corridor on Sydney Road Southwest. And the idea is that we want to create a small downtown area, a little kind of miniature downtown Main Street type feel just north of the intersection of Sydney and Sedgwick. And that would include on-street parking. It would include shop fronts that are brought up to the street and allow for mixed use construction above the commercial. This is a rendering that shows kind of the center of this little neighborhood. And to the rear, on the east side of Sydney, these apartments could either be a park and ride. Kitsap Transit has been doing their park and ride study and has identified this as a candidate site, or it could provide additional residential capacity. And we've also identified a park to be located kind of on the floodplains out to the east of this site, and doing some sort of natural restoration with limited active recreation with pathways, and any type of playground or picnic shelters would have to be out of the floodplain. But you could certainly build trails and have meadows and grass areas that are available on the floodplain itself. So the concept kind of is broken into 3 areas. There's the central core, which is kind of the heart of the neighborhood. We really want to focus on aligning driveways to ensure that turning movements can be accommodated safely with mid-block pedestrian crossings so that people can get from one side of the street to the other. The north end of the neighborhood is mostly multifamily housing. This is, you have to have enough rooftops to support kind of a vibrant commercial area like downtown Port Orchard. You have to have a customer base living in walking distance to these types of developments, because otherwise you have to build a sea of parking for people to drive there. And while parking is proposed, we don't want it to be the dominant characteristic of the neighborhood. So the north end on the east side of the road over here is this development is already in design. They're proposing about 238 apartments at that location, but you'll notice that the apartments are brought out to the street so that they create more of a neighborhood feel as you're walking down the sidewalk. On the other side of the road, we don't have any specific plans for this owner, who actually, that was where we had the noise variance application at our last council meeting. They haven't indicated any interest in developing, but it's actually a really good site for development because there aren't a lot of critical areas. It's dry, it's got good soils, and so we would see that as supporting potentially a decent amount of population.
Okay, Nick, just for orientation, if you go back to your last picture,
Yeah,
the road right down at the bottom is Little Glenwood, correct?
correct. That's Little Glenwood, and Sidney Glen Elementary is right just
here.
off the bottom of the page.
Okay, thank you for the orientation.
Yeah. Then the south end down at Sidney and Sedgwick this is where we've got these live work units on the ground floor. So you can see the building is brought right out to the sidewalk. You've got larger glass windows along the ground floor, which serve as sort of shop front type spaces, but it's still largely residential. The parking is tucked behind the building, but it gives a more urban feel to the area. And this rendering is based on the concept plan that the owner of that property brought to us recently. And we said, you know, we're supportive of what you're trying to do. We understand the economics of it. And I think that's about a 50 or 60 unit project, with a third of those units as being these live work units that can be commercial on the bottom.
I know this. Go ahead. I'll say my question.
No, that's okay.
No, I was going to say you may answer it with what the next slide. You know, my question is, I know this is long term, but how do we resolve the issue of traffic on that area from Sydney to 16, which is
it's on our traffic plan already to fix Sedgwick
right.
and widen it. So
right.
It's just a matter of getting that to the top of the list on our transportation funding scheme. And, you know, our challenge is that we don't have a revenue stream for transportation, and development is one way to generate revenue to pay for some of these. And so you're going to have a period where you have to build some things, accumulate the traffic impact fees so that then you can fix the problems. And this is one of those cases. I've started doing some economic analysis on if this neighborhood is fully built out, what does the revenue to the city look like over a 20-year period, including the upfront development costs and impact fees. And it's about $100 million in development revenue to the city, but it also requires about $70 million in investment to put all of the infrastructure to support this. And so, and those are really rough preliminary numbers, but, and once you adjust the impact fees, obviously that number increases, because we're talking about 1,600 units at probably for multifamily, I think it's about $3,200 per unit in revenue that comes in. And so that gives us the money to actually improve Sydney and improve Sedgwick to serve the development.
Unfortunately, it gets worse before it gets better, because we have to generate the revenue somehow.
Right. Yeah. I just see that as and we all know this, you know, as a major sticking point. And, you know,
it's bad, but it's gotten better since Tremont's opened up. And now we have, you know, at least an alternative that moves.
Okay. Mayor, hold that thought.
So in terms of the capacity, I mentioned about 1,600 additional residential units. We did some analysis, and actually Kitsap Transit has been, because they've been looking at Site B, they gave us some feedback on their findings for critical areas. But everything in the crosshatch gray is off limits for development for the most part, with the exception of parks potentially. And so we've calculated the capacity for development. And as you go through the study, you'll see that we have, you know, the population today in this area is 464 people. The population at total build out is about 1,816 people. Likewise, employment would go from 371 today up to about 652, and that's based on square footages that we've calculated based on the area of developable land, minus parking, minus critical areas.
Can you back up to that other graphic? Was that our graphic, or something Transit created this?
That's our graphic.
Can we, in the future, make sure we're using our logo and not the City Hall logo?
Yes.
Nick, is the gray area, would that be eligible for like low impact parking where you're parking?
Probably not,
Okay.
because it's floodplain, but there's also critical area buffers. And it really depends on the extent of the critical area buffers. I think that you can build in a floodplain, provided that you elevate a structure, or if it, in the case of parking, it's okay if a parking lot floods, it's just going to be off limits for a period of time. But it's certainly challenging. It's more challenging to build in the floodplain. And I think the floodplains actually have significant mitigation value for other projects that are looking for places to mitigate. And so it may be more valuable as a site for mitigation than it would be for parking or any other use. So other maps that are really critical in our design guidelines currently, we designate streets based on their type. And so you can see here that the red area on Sydney, this midsection, that is going to be designated a storefront street. Currently, it is a varied storefront. So you can either do a landscape setback or you can bring buildings out to the street. This changes our code to require that the buildings come out to the street for this short segment to sort of create that main street feel. And so that's one significant change that will be implemented as a result of this plan. And scrolling down, so I've provided some estimates of new housing units here, and what actually happens and what's theoretically possible are certainly going to differ, but we estimate about 1,300 new residents coming to the neighborhood based on a 2.09 persons per household number. And of course, if these units end up being overwhelmingly studio or single bed or 1-bedroom units versus 2- and 3-bedroom units, that could also change our population estimates. Moving on through the plan, once we get into the utilities and the transportation section, we're really identifying all the projects that are needed to sort of implement this plan. The utility projects are specifically called out because they are directly needed to serve development. The transportation chapter mostly focuses on the physical improvements to the corridor, and all of those projects are actually kept in the 20-year traffic plan. But you can see here that we've identified a handful of restoration projects, including the Blackjack Creek culvert removal that WashDOT is doing. And then we've actually applied for a grant to replace the culvert for Ruby Creek under Sydney Road. And then we've also put in there money that we would potentially seek in the form of grants to do some floodplain restoration in the future if we acquire a park in that vicinity. And along with this update, we will be probably identifying a planned park for the neighborhood in the parks plan, which is happening simultaneously. So, so that is discussed here. And as far as the water and sewer infrastructure, you see about 8 projects here. Also, some undergrounding of power through that Main Street section of Sydney. You don't want because the mixed use buildings are out to the street, you can't have overhead power lines because they're too close to the buildings. So that's going to require some undergrounding of utilities. And the sewer projects and water projects are consistent with what we've been discussing in our water and sewer plan updates. So that's really a summary of the plan. We've got road section drawings showing how the road changes throughout the corridor. In the commercial area, you see the storefronts are right out on the sidewalk with an extra wide sidewalk with a turn lane and median and parallel parking. In the north end of the corridor, it's a landscape strip with sidewalks that are only 6 feet, and there's a bit of a setback to the buildings so the buildings are a little further off the street. That's the apartments in the north end. And then where you cross Ruby Creek, the road really has to slim down to minimize the length of that culvert. And so you lose the center median and turn lane, and you get rid of the landscape strip for a short period where you try to narrow the road across the creek. So that's it. Like I said, we're gonna present this to the Planning Commission tomorrow night, and our plan is to hold a public hearing on this at the Planning Commission in August. And if you have any feedback prior to this going to hearing or any changes that you think are needed, we are happy to look at those and try to get in front of those before we open it up for the public hearing.
I really like it. I especially like that there are bike lanes, and I like the I guess you're calling it the block frontage or buildings flush with street. Has that happened? Have we done that anywhere else in the city?
Downtown has that designation, but the storefronts, the block frontage for storefronts really don't exist outside of downtown. And as we develop other sub-area plans, we will probably identify locations for more development that looks like that. I think when we do the Mile Hill Center there along Mile Hill at Retzel, I think the four-way intersection at Retzel and Mile Hill could end up taking a form similar to that to make it more pedestrian oriented, especially if the Armory were to redevelop someday. But you know, we have to go through each of those processes for each neighborhood and sort of see what makes sense.
Yeah, well, very nice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's all for today.
Okay. Any other comments or anything for the good of the order?
A lot of good information.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, I guess we are adjourned.
All right. Stop
Dave,
the
you
recording.
want to ask your question here, or do you want to have a conversation offline?
Oh, no, it's